In the humid Georgia summer of 1958, during the court-ordered demolition of the old Columbia County Courthouse, a discovery was made that would challenge the very foundations of the region's history. Mortared inside a brick wall, sealed away from light and memory for over a century, workers found a small lead-lined rosewood box. Within it lay the bizarre secret of the most beautiful slave man in Georgia history, a tale from 1838 so dangerous it was deliberately buried. The box contained a collection of letters from the county's most powerful families, and an unfinished report from a magistrate who seemed to have lost his mind. His frantic opening lines pose a question that history has refused to answer. How did a single, powerless man bring down an entire society without lifting a hand, using only the truth as his weapon? What happened in Columbia County was not a massacre of the body, but a carefully orchestrated conflagration of the soul, a mystery of the human heart that science could never explain. The story of Adrian, the enslaved man whose very existence was considered a threat, reveals a dark truth about the nature of power and the terrifying weight of hidden sins. It is a story of a family dynasty built on secrets, a church that mistook justice for demonic influence, and a buried crime that festered in the dark until it was brought into the light. The official records were sanitized, the deaths attributed to tragedy, but the contents of this box tell a different story, the tale of a reckoning that was both inevitable and impossible. Before we unseal this forgotten archive and expose the truth of what happened in 1838, we invite you to become part of our community of historical investigators. If you believe that the most compelling stories are the ones that have been deliberately hidden, subscribe to Before the Story and enable all notifications so you never miss an excavation into the past. Please take a moment to like this video. It tells us that you value these deep dives into our most challenging histories. And now, let us know in the comments from what part of the world you're joining us to uncover this story tonight. The first document from the unearthed rosewood box is the unfinished report of Magistrate William Thorne, dated October 1838. His handwriting, elegant at the start, devolves into a desperate scrawl, a testament to a mind under siege. He begins not as a man of law, but as a chronicler of a moral collapse, setting the stage in a world that appeared on its surface to be the pinnacle of Southern order. Columbia County, Georgia, in the 1830s, was a kingdom built on cotton. Its wealth was new, but its hierarchies were ancient, enforced with the certainty of divine will. The planter families, the Blackwoods, the Carvers, the Thorns, formed a tight-knit aristocracy, their fortunes and bloodlines intertwined, their authority absolute and unquestioned. This was a society governed by a rigid code of honor, a veneer of piety that concealed a profound spiritual insecurity. The church stood as the moral center of the community, its sermons on sin and redemption providing a language for the anxieties that festered beneath the surface. Social life was a carefully staged performance of gentility and control, where every gesture was freighted with meaning and every deviation from the norm was met with swift, silent correction. The system was designed to be unbreakable, its foundations rooted in the ownership of human beings, a truth so fundamental that to question it was to question reality itself, to invite chaos into a world meticulously constructed to keep it at bay. Into this brittle world, the magistrate's report introduces a figure who, by his very nature, represented a paradox. Adrian, an enslaved man on the Blackwood plantation, was a living contradiction. He was not merely handsome. He possessed a form of beauty that was classical, symmetrical, and profoundly unsettling to the white establishment. His features were fine, his posture erect, his gaze direct and intelligent. He moved with a grace that seemed innate, not learned, a physical manifestation of a spirit that refused to be defined by its bondage. His existence was an affront to the carefully constructed racial theories of the time, a silent challenge to the narrative of inferiority that justified the entire institution of slavery. The report notes that Adrian was the third generation of his family to serve on the Blackwood plantation. His grandmother had been among the first enslaved people brought to the county, his mother a respected house servant. This lineage gave him a unique position within the slave quarters, a keeper of history, a repository of the community's unwritten memories. But it also gave him an intimate and dangerous proximity to the masters themselves. He had grown up in the shadow of the great house, observing its occupants not as distant, godlike figures, but as flawed human beings, their weaknesses and hypocrisies laid bare in the unguarded moments of domestic life. Thorne writes that the men of the county developed a habit of avoiding Adrian's name in conversation, as if speaking it might conjure the unease he inspired. The women, however, were a different matter. They spoke of him in hushed, almost mythical terms, describing his presence as something akin to a spiritual apparition. He was a figure of intense fascination and quiet dread, a living symbol of a beauty and intelligence that was not supposed to exist within the confines of his station. He was, in essence, a mirror in which the society saw a distorted and terrifying reflection of its own deepest contradictions. The magistrate's report frames the coming events not as a rebellion, but as a kind of moral contagion. It began not with an act of violence or a word of sedition, but with a series of quiet, almost imperceptible shifts in the emotional landscape of the community. It started with whispers, with furtive conversations by garden walls, with a growing melancholy among the plantation mistresses. No laws were broken, no challenges were issued, yet the very fabric of their world began to unravel. The source of this decay, Thorne insists, was not what Adrian did, but what he represented. A truth so profound that it could not be spoken, and so powerful that it could not be contained. The document establishes the central mystery with haunting clarity. Adrian never raised a hand, never incited a revolt, never sought freedom in the conventional sense. His power was of a different order entirely. He possessed a secret, a forbidden knowledge of the human heart, passed down through generations as a tool of survival. He understood the hidden desires, the marital insecurities, and the secret shames of the landowning class with an almost scientific precision. This knowledge, in a world built on carefully maintained illusions, was more dangerous than any weapon. The box itself, unearthed a century later, stands as a physical testament to the story's suppressed nature. Its lead lining was designed to protect its contents not just from the elements, but from the judgment of history. Magistrate Thorne, in his final coherent passage, explains his decision to entomb the records. Some truths are like plagues. They cannot be cured, only contained. To burn these letters would be a lie. To release them would be a massacre. Let them sleep in the foundations of the law they broke, and pray they are never awakened. The stage is set for the revelation of a crime that was not against the law, but against the natural order as they understood it. The magistrate's opening serves as a desperate prologue, written by a man who has witnessed the end of his world. He is not merely documenting events. He is attempting to explain the inexplicable, to give rational form to a series of events that defied all logic. He presents Adrian not as a man, but as a catalyst, a force of nature that exposed the rot at the core of their society. The story that follows is not just about one man's quiet rebellion, but about the catastrophic consequences of a society's refusal to confront the truths it has buried within itself. The first piece of contemporary evidence that chronicles the beginning of the end is found not in the magistrate's box, but in the archives of the Georgia Presbyterian Church, the personal diary of Reverend Michael Davies. Davies was a man of rigid faith and profound intellectual pride, his worldview a fortress built of scripture and Southern tradition. His diary, filled with theological musings and parish concerns, serves as an unwitting record of a mystery he could only interpret through the lens of spiritual warfare. An entry from the spring of 1838 marks the first documented anomaly, the moment Adrian ceased to be part of the landscape and became a figure of intense, disturbing focus. Davies writes of visiting the Blackwood plantation to offer spiritual counsel to Mrs. Eleanora Blackwood, who had fallen into a state of deep melancholy. As he walked the grounds, he observed Adrian tending the gardens. It was a mundane scene, yet the Reverend describes it with the language of a supernatural encounter. He notes, "He possesses a stillness that is not born of servitude, but of observation." His beauty is of a classical, unnerving sort that confounds our established notions of the races. It is a beauty that does not invite desire, but rather commands a kind of fearful respect, as if one is in the presence of an ancient, knowing soul. The Reverend's description reveals a mind struggling to categorize what it sees. He attempts to dissect Adrian's physical appearance, the flawless skin, the fine features, the bright, clear eyes, but finds that the whole is more disturbing than the sum of its parts. It is Adrian's bearing, his posture, that truly unnerves him. He does not carry himself like an enslaved man, with the stooped shoulders and downcast eyes of one who has been broken. He moves with a deliberate, almost regal economy of motion, his gaze calm and level. Davies notes, "When he looks upon you, it is not with the deference of a slave, but with the calm assessment of a physician diagnosing an ailment." This encounter plants a seed of profound unease in the Reverend's mind. He is a man whose authority is built on the interpretation of souls, on being the sole conduit for the confessions and spiritual anxieties of his flock. Yet, in Adrian, he senses a rival, a silent, unsanctioned confessor who seems to understand the very secrets Davies believes are his domain. He writes, "I find myself preaching of humility and sin from the pulpit, while feeling he, a man in bondage, understands the subject in a way that is not theological, but innate." It is as if he sees the sin in us, not as a transgression against God, but as a simple, observable fact of our nature. Davies' initial reaction is to rationalize the anomaly within his own framework. He concludes that Adrian's unsettling presence must be a divine test, a temptation sent by God to fortify the morals of the whites. He preaches a sermon the following Sunday on the dangers of beauty and the seductive nature of a pleasing exterior that might mask a corrupt interior. He speaks of the devil's ability to appear as an angel of light, a clear though unnamed reference to the man in the Blackwood Gardens. This marks the beginning of his public campaign against an enemy only he can see. The diary entry reveals more about the Reverend's own insecurities than it does about Adrian. He is a man whose power depends on the moral weakness of others, on their need for his guidance and absolution. Adrian, in his silent self-possession, represents a form of moral authority that exists entirely outside the church, outside the established hierarchy. He does not need the Reverend's God to understand the human soul. He seems to read it directly, an ability that Davies can only interpret as demonic in origin. This first documented encounter sets the tone for the escalating tension. The conflict is not physical, but metaphysical. Adrian's very being is an act of defiance, a challenge to the foundational beliefs of his society. He does not need to speak of rebellion. His existence is rebellion. The Reverend, in turn, is not fighting a man, but a symbol. He is fighting the terrifying possibility that the racial and moral order he has dedicated his life to upholding is built on a lie that Adrian's quiet dignity exposes with every passing moment. The entry concludes with a note of foreshadowing that is, in retrospect, chilling. Davies reflects on the faces of the women in his congregation during his sermon. He notes that while the men nodded in agreement, their wives, particularly Eleanora Blackwood and Elizabeth Thorne, seemed distant, their expressions unreadable. "It is as if," he writes, "they were listening to a different sermon entirely, one whispered to them, not from the pulpit, but from the silence of their own hearts." I fear a schism is coming, not of doctrine, but of truth. The Reverend's account provides the first glimpse of the schism that will tear the community apart. It establishes the central players and the nature of the conflict. It is a battle of narratives, the public, sanctioned narrative of the church and the planters versus the private, unspoken narrative that is beginning to coalesce around Adrian. The anomaly has been documented, the first stone has been cast, and the placid surface of Columbia County society has begun to ripple with the first signs of a coming storm. In the weeks and months that followed Reverend Davies's initial encounter, the anomalous evidence began to accumulate, a slow drip of poison into the community's bloodstream. His diary becomes a fever chart, meticulously tracking the spread of a spiritual malady he cannot comprehend. He records a marked increase in his pastoral visits to the wives of the county's leading families. These women, once pillars of social stability, had grown morbidly introspective, their conversations filled with a vague, disquieting language of guilt and hidden sins. They spoke of a need for a more profound form of confession, one that the formal rituals of the church could no longer satisfy. The evidence was not confined to the Reverend's diary. The magistrate's box contains a small collection of letters exchanged between the planters during that summer of 1838. These documents, written in the blunt, unsentimental language of businessmen, reveal a growing paranoia. Josiah Blackwood, in a letter to his cousin and fellow planter Thomas Carver, complains of a change in his wife, Eleanora. She returns from her walks in a state of melancholy I cannot penetrate. She speaks in riddles of forgiveness and the weight of unatoned sins. This affliction began a month ago, after she took to the habit of speaking with that boy, Adrian, by the gardens. She claims he offers her a peculiar kind of peace. This pattern repeats itself across the correspondence. Thomas Carver writes back of a similar change in his own wife, Sarah, who has become distant and prone to weeping. He notes that she, too, has been seen in quiet conversation with Adrian. The men are baffled and enraged. They cannot comprehend what is happening within their own homes. Their wives, whom they considered their property, as much as their land and the people who worked it, were developing a secret, interior life, one to which they had no access. Their authority, which they believed to be absolute, was being subtly undermined. The Reverend's diary documents his attempts to intervene. He confronts Eleanora Blackwood, urging her to confess her troubles to him in the sanctity of the Lord's house. He describes her response with frustration and alarm. She looked at me with a profound sadness and said, "Reverend, Some truths are too heavy for the ears of a righteous man. They can only be given to one who has no judgment to offer, only the silence of shared suffering. Her words were a clear, though gentle, rebuke. She had found a new confessor, and he was a slave. This encounter confirms his deepest fears. His spiritual authority was being usurped. The tension escalates when the planters begin to connect the changes in their wives to Adrian's influence. They see it not as a series of individual spiritual crises, but as a coordinated assault on their households. Their letters speak of Adrian with a mixture of contempt and a strange, almost superstitious fear. They refer to his insolent bearing, his unnatural calm, and the spell he seems to cast on their women. They are men of action, accustomed to solving problems with force, yet they are faced with a problem they cannot whip, buy, or sell. The evidence suggests that Adrian's method was one of passive absorption. He did not offer advice or incite rebellion. The women sought him out, drawn by his reputation for quiet wisdom. In a society where they were expected to be decorative and silent, he offered something revolutionary, a receptive ear. He listened, without judgment, to the stories of their unhappy marriages, their hidden griefs, their complicity in a system that oppressed them almost as much as it did him. He became a vessel for their unspoken truths. This accumulation of evidence paints a picture of a society slowly poisoning itself with its own secrets. The women, unburdened for the first time, experience a kind of spiritual awakening, a recognition of their own moral agency. The men, sensing a loss of control they cannot understand, react with increasing aggression and suspicion. The social fabric, woven from threads of denial and performance, begins to fray at the edges. Adrian remains at the center of it all, a silent, passive figure who is nonetheless the catalyst for the entire process. One of the most telling documents from this period is a brief, unsigned note found tucked into the Reverend's diary. The handwriting is identified as belonging to Elizabeth Thorne, the magistrate's wife. It reads simply, "You mistake the symptom for the disease. The illness is not in him. It is in the silence he has broken." This note suggests that at least one person in the community understood what was truly happening. It was not a demonic possession or a slave's insolence, but the simple, terrifying consequence of truth being spoken in a world built on lies. The evidence from that summer points to an inescapable conclusion. The planters of Columbia County were not afraid of what Adrian might do, but of what he already knew. They had spent their lives cultivating an image of themselves as benevolent patriarchs, masters of an orderly and righteous world. Adrian, by simply listening, was dismantling that illusion, one confession at a time. He held up a mirror, and they were horrified by the reflection. The anomalies were no longer isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a clear and present danger to the established order. Action, they concluded, must be taken. Faced with a growing crisis that defied all rational explanation, Reverend Michael Davies, in a frantic and lengthy diary entry from late July 1838, formulates the first coherent hypothesis to explain the events unfolding in Columbia County. His conclusion, born of a mixture of genuine fear and intellectual arrogance, would frame the conflict for the white community and set the stage for the tragic events to come. He rejected any social or psychological explanation for the women's behavior, instead embracing a narrative that was far more ancient and, to him, more terrifying. The community was under demonic assault, and Adrian was its earthly vessel. The entry begins with a detailed, almost legalistic summary of the evidence he has gathered. He lists the names of the afflicted women, Eleonora Blackwood, Sarah Carver, Elizabeth Thorne, and others, and meticulously cross-references their symptoms: morbid introspection, a rejection of pastoral authority, and a shared secretive connection to the enslaved man, Adrian. He writes, "A contagion of the spirit has taken hold of our most pious women. It spreads not by touch or by air, but through whispered words, in the shade of the magnolia trees. The common vector, the patient zero of this plague, is clear. It is him. It is Adrian." Davies dismisses the idea that the women are simply confiding in a sympathetic listener. To him, this is an unthinkable breach of the natural order. For a white woman of high station to unburden her soul to an enslaved man was not just a social transgression, it was a spiritual abomination. He writes, "They do not confess to me in the Lord's house under the forgiving gaze of the Almighty. They confess to a man who is chattel, a being without a soul in the eyes of a just and orderly society. This is not a search for solace. This is an act of spiritual inversion, a turning away from the light towards a source of profound darkness." His hypothesis solidifies as he recounts a recent disturbing dream. In the dream, he saw Adrian standing in the center of his church, not in the chains of a slave, but in the robes of a priest. The congregation, composed entirely of the women of the parish, knelt before him, their faces turned up in rapt adoration. Davies describes the dream as a divine warning, a vision of the spiritual coup that was taking place in his community. "He has not laid a hand on them, nor spoken a word of sedition," he writes, his script growing more agitated, "yet he is dismantling their souls from within. This is not the work of a man, it is the work of an incubus, a demon who feeds on secrets instead of flesh." This supernatural explanation served a crucial purpose for Davies and the men of the community. It transformed a complex social and psychological crisis into a simple, Manichaean struggle between good and evil. It was no longer about unhappy marriages, systemic cruelty, or the moral compromises of slave ownership. It was a holy war. Adrian was not a person with a history and a consciousness. He was a conduit for a malevolent force. The women were not individuals exercising a newfound agency. They were hapless victims, bewitched and ensnared by a diabolical power. The Reverend's theory, articulated with the full force of his theological authority, gave the planters the moral justification they needed to act. They were no longer just angry husbands trying to control their wives. They were soldiers of Christ, defending their homes and their community from a supernatural threat. Davies' diary details his efforts to spread this hypothesis, first in private conversations with the planters, and then, more subtly, from the pulpit. His sermons became darker, filled with warnings about false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing. The hypothesis also reveals the profound limitations of the Reverend's worldview. He was a man of books and doctrines, incapable of seeing the humanity in those who existed outside his rigid social categories. Faced with a phenomenon that contradicted his understanding of the world, he did not question his own assumptions. Instead, he reached for the most extreme explanation available, one that affirmed his own role as the community's spiritual defender. He was not just interpreting events, he was creating a narrative that would allow for a violent resolution. This moment marks a critical turning point. The problem of Adrian is no longer a domestic or social issue. It has been elevated to the level of a spiritual crisis. The Reverend's hypothesis provides a name for the formless anxiety that has gripped the community, and in doing so, it gives that anxiety a target. The conflict is no longer about unspoken truths, it is about casting out a demon. The stage is set for an exorcism, and the men of Columbia County are preparing to carry it out. The entry concludes with a chilling passage that reveals the depth of Davy's conviction. He writes, "The Lord has often used humble instruments to test the faith of his people. He has sent plagues and floods, prophets and martyrs. Now he has sent us this trial, this beautiful silent vessel of corruption. We must not fail the test. The demon must be cast out even if the vessel must be broken in the process. The first hypothesis has been formulated, and it is a death sentence." The institutionalization of Reverend Davy's demonic hypothesis sent a fissure through the heart of Columbia County, a social fracture that is starkly recorded in the documents found in the magistrate's box. The community, once united by a shared code of conduct and belief, began to split along lines of gender, power, and conscience. The men, emboldened by the Reverend's righteous rhetoric, closed ranks, their paranoia solidifying into a unified, aggressive front. The women, in turn, retreated further into a world of silent, shared understanding, their allegiance shifting from their husbands and their pastor to the very man who was being condemned. The most formal record of this fracture is a petition dated August 1838, signed by Josiah Blackwood, Thomas Carver, and 12 other prominent landowners. The document, addressed to Magistrate William Thorne, is a masterpiece of sanctimonious fury. It demands immediate action against Adrian, citing not any specific crime, but his very nature. The petition calls for him to be sold out of state, or, failing that, to be subjected to a public whipping, sufficient to correct his insolent bearing and break the unholy spell he has cast upon the women of our households. The language is a direct echo of Davy's sermons, cloaking personal anxieties in the garb of moral outrage. This document represents the formal declaration of war by the patriarchal establishment. It is an attempt to use the instruments of law and violence to solve a problem that is fundamentally spiritual and psychological. The planters were not just trying to punish a slave, they were trying to reassert control over their wives and restore the shattered illusion of their own authority. Adrian was the focal point of their rage, but the true targets were the women who had dared to have a consciousness independent of their own. The petition was a demand for the restoration of a silence that had been irrevocably broken. In stark contrast to this public declaration, the box contains a private record of the opposition, a torn, unsigned letter, which forensic analysis in the 20th century identified as being in the hand of Elizabeth Thorne, the magistrate's own wife. The letter, presumably written to her husband, is a plea for conscience. It reads, "He is a blameless listener in a world where women are commanded to be silent. They seek to punish him not for what he does, but for what he knows of them. If you, as the embodiment of the law, allow this injustice, then you are not a magistrate, but a party to their tyranny. The sin is not his, it is theirs, and it is a sin of pride and fear." This letter is a remarkable document of quiet rebellion. It reveals the existence of a counter-narrative, a different interpretation of events that was being shared among the women. Elizabeth Thorne was not bewitched or deluded. She saw the situation with perfect clarity. She understood that Adrian was not a demon, but a mirror, and that the men were trying to shatter it rather than face their own reflection. Her letter to her husband places him at the epicenter of the social fracture, forcing him to choose between the law of his peers and the quiet, insistent voice of his own conscience. The fracture was not limited to the great houses. Reverend Davy's diary notes a change in his congregation. The church, once a symbol of unity, became a place of division. The men sat on one side, their faces set in grim determination, while their wives sat on the other, their expressions veiled and distant. Davies writes of a wall of silence that had descended between husbands and wives, a cold, unspoken hostility that permeated every aspect of community life. Dinners became tense, silent affairs. Social gatherings were cancelled. The performance of gentility had collapsed. This social breakdown is further evidenced by a decline in economic activity recorded in local ledgers from that period. Cotton shipments were delayed, business partnerships became strained, and long-standing credit arrangements were called into question. The planters, consumed by the crisis in their homes, were neglecting the very source of their wealth. The social order and the economic order were inextricably linked, and as one began to crumble, so did the other. The poison was spreading from the households to the fields. The fracture reached its most dangerous point when the men began to suspect each other. Josiah Blackwood, in a letter, accuses Thomas Carver of being soft on the issue, of not doing enough to control his wife's behavior. The unified front of the planters was beginning to crack under the pressure of their shared paranoia. They were united in their fear of Adrian, but they were also rivals, and the crisis was exacerbating their long-standing competitions. Each man feared that his neighbor's weakness would bring ruin upon them all. The documents from this period paint a picture of a society at war with itself. The fracture was not just between men and women, but between public narrative and private truth, between institutional power and individual conscience, between law and justice. At the center of this storm stood Adrian, a silent, enigmatic figure who had, without a single act of aggression, brought the entire edifice of Columbia County society to the brink of collapse. The community had been broken, and the question that hung in the air was whether it could ever be put back together again. The simmering conflict in Columbia County reached a point of no return in early September 1838, an event detailed in a document that provides irrefutable evidence of the planters' brutality and, more significantly, of Adrian's extraordinary nature. This evidence is a sworn affidavit from Dr. Alistair Finch, the county physician, a man of science and a respected neutral figure in the community. His testimony, found in the magistrate's box, transforms the story from one of social tension to one of mythical confrontation, and its impact on the key players was profound and irreversible. Josiah Blackwood, taking matters into his own hands, had Adrian subjected to a brutal whipping. The affidavit details Dr. Finch's summons to the Blackwood plantation to tend to the aftermath. The physician's language is clinical, detached, yet it fails to conceal his horror. He describes Adrian's condition with forensic precision, noting the extensive tissue damage to his back and the severe blood loss. He had been subjected to a level of physical punishment that I have seldom witnessed, Dr. Finch writes. By all medical precedent, the man should have been unconscious, if not already expired. The shock to the system alone would have been sufficient to kill a man of lesser constitution. But Adrian was not dead. He was not even unconscious. This is the first and most critical piece of irrefutable evidence. Dr. Finch describes finding him lying on a pallet in a storage shed, his breathing shallow but regular. As the doctor began to clean and dress the wounds, Adrian opened his eyes. The physician notes his eyes were not clouded with pain or fever. They were perfectly clear, lucid, and possessed of a focus that was deeply unsettling. It was the gaze of a man whose spirit was entirely detached from the suffering of his body. This observation elevates Adrian from a mere victim to something more, a figure of almost supernatural endurance. The affidavit then records the moment that would haunt the doctor and reshape the narrative. As Dr. Finch tended to his wounds, Adrian spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper, but his words clear and precise. He looked directly at the physician and said, "The truth does not bleed, doctor. It only waits." This statement, delivered by a man who should have been incapable of speech, is the central turning point of the story. It is a declaration of invincibility, a confirmation that the planter's violence was utterly futile. They could break his body, but they could not touch the source of his power. The impact of this event, as documented in other sources, was immediate and catastrophic for the planter's cause. Dr. Finch, a man of unimpeachable integrity, shared his account with Magistrate Thorne and Reverend Davies. His testimony shattered the narrative of a simple corrective punishment. It was now clear that this was an act of extreme, almost homicidal violence, and that it had failed. Adrian had not only survived, he had emerged from the ordeal as a figure of even greater moral authority. His endurance was seen as a sign, a miracle of sorts, that solidified the women's belief in his special nature. For Reverend Davies, the event was a terrifying confirmation of his demonic hypothesis. He writes in his diary, "No mortal man could withstand such a trial. The flesh is weak, but his is animated by a force that is not of this world. They sought to cast out the demon, but they have only succeeded in revealing its true strength. The vessel was broken, but the spirit within remains untouched, and I fear, empowered." He saw Adrian's survival not as a testament to human resilience, a Christian virtue, but as proof of his inhuman nature. For the planters, the impact was one of utter psychological defeat. They had deployed their ultimate weapon, absolute physical violence, and it had been rendered meaningless. Their authority was based on the power to inflict pain and death, and Adrian had, through his survival, stripped them of that power. They were now faced with an enemy they could not hurt, an idea they could not kill. Their rage, finding no release, curdled into a cold, impotent fear. They had created a martyr, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. The affidavit of Dr. Finch is the irrefutable evidence that changes everything. It is a scientific, objective account of an event that borders on the miraculous. It validates the women's faith, intensifies the reverend's fear, and exposes the planter's brutality for what it was. It documents the moment when Adrian ceased to be a passive object of fascination and became an active, almost mythical symbol of resistance. The planters had tried to silence him with the lash, but they had only succeeded in giving his silence a voice that was now louder than ever. The story had reached a point of metaphysical crisis. The community was no longer just fractured, it was polarized. On one side were those who saw Adrian as a saint, a man who could endure unspeakable suffering and emerge with his spirit intact. On the other were those who saw him as a demon, a being whose unnatural resilience was proof of his evil. There was no longer any middle ground. The irrefutable evidence had been presented, and its impact was to force everyone to choose a side in a war that was no longer just social, but cosmic. In the wake of Adrian's survival, the formal structures of authority in Columbia County began to collapse, not with a sudden crash, but with a slow, grinding decay recorded in the private ledgers and panicked correspondence of the men in power. The law, the church, and the patriarchal order of the plantation, the three pillars of their society, were all proving to be hollow, incapable of containing the crisis that Adrian had unleashed. The authority they had taken for granted was revealed to be a fragile consensus, and that consensus was now broken. The most intimate record of this collapse is found in the personal ledger of Magistrate William Thorne. His entries from September 1838 are no longer the measured notes of a jurist, but the tormented confessions of a man whose faith in the law has been shattered. He writes, "Blackwood demands justice for what he calls Adrian's insolence. My own wife calls it a mortal sin to punish an innocent man. I am the law in this county, yet I am powerless, caught between the brutal pride of men who believe they are the law and the hidden despair of their wives who have lost all faith in it. I feel the foundations of our order cracking beneath my feet. Thorne's dilemma was absolute. To honor the planters' petition would be to sanction an act of barbaric injustice, a fact made undeniable by Dr. Finch's testimony. To refuse them would be to defy the entire power structure of the county, to alienate his peers, and to risk his own position and safety. The law, which he had believed to be a neutral arbiter of justice, was revealed to be nothing more than an instrument for enforcing the will of the powerful. It had no answer for a crisis of conscience. His authority as a magistrate was rendered meaningless because the moral authority on which it was based had evaporated. The authority of the church was collapsing in parallel. Reverend Davis's diary reveals a man losing control of his flock and his own narrative. His demonic hypothesis, which he had hoped would unify the community against a common enemy, had instead deepened the divide. The women no longer listened to his sermons. They attended church as a matter of social obligation, but their spirits were elsewhere. He writes of a congregation of ghosts, of preaching to empty eyes and closed hearts. His authority depended on his ability to interpret God's will, but the events were now interpreting themselves in a way that contradicted his every word. The Reverend's desperation is palpable in an entry where he describes confronting Elizabeth Thorne. He accused her of leading the other women astray, of succumbing to a dangerous, heretical influence. Her response, which he records verbatim, represents the complete collapse of his pastoral authority. "Reverend," she said calmly, "authority is not a title. It is a moral weight. You have chosen to side with the rage of guilty men, and in doing so, you have forfeited your claim to that weight. We are not lost. We are, for the first time, finding our way." He had been dismissed not with anger, but with a quiet pity that was far more devastating. Within the plantations themselves, the authority of the masters was disintegrating. The letters between planters speak of a new mood among the enslaved population. Adrian's survival had become a legend, a whispered story of defiance that spread from one plantation to the next. There was no open rebellion, but there was a change in the air, a new stillness, a new watchfulness. The planters, already consumed by the turmoil in their homes, now felt a rising tide of silent insubordination from the quarters. Their control, once absolute, now felt tenuous and conditional. This collapse of authority created a power vacuum. The formal leaders, the magistrate, the reverend, the planters, were paralyzed, unable to act effectively. The magistrate was trapped by his conscience, the reverend by his failed narrative, and the planters by their impotent rage. The community was adrift, without a moral or legal compass. It was in this vacuum that Adrian, who held no formal power whatsoever, became the de facto center of gravity, the silent figure around whom all the chaos revolved. Thorne's ledger reveals his growing realization that the system he served was designed to protect crimes, not to punish them. The crime of slavery itself, the daily brutalities, the hidden sins of the masters. The law existed to perpetuate this order, not to question it. He was a keeper of a corrupt peace, and that peace had been shattered. His authority had collapsed because he had come to see that it was not legitimate in the first place. He was an officer of a court that served injustice. The final record of this collapse is Thorne's decision to seek a third path. He could not side with the planters, and he could not openly defy them. His ledger entry from late September reads, "The law has failed. The church has failed. The order of men has failed. There can be no justice in this matter through the channels we have established. A different kind of reckoning is required, one that operates outside the boundaries of our failed institutions. His paralysis was finally broken, not by a legal precedent, but by a moral imperative. He understood that he had to act, but he no longer knew what law he was supposed to be serving. The narrative, as recorded by Magistrate Thorne, reaches its dramatic apex with the discovery of a new, hidden source of evidence, an event that would irrevocably alter the course of the crisis. On a humid evening in late September 1838, as Thorne sat in his study contemplating the ruins of his authority, a figure appeared at his door. It was Adrian, barely recovered from his ordeal, his back still a map of his suffering, yet moving with that same unshakable calm that so unnerved the community. He did not come to plead his case or to seek protection. He came as a courier of judgment. Thorne's report describes the encounter with a sense of awe and dread. Adrian did not speak a single word. His presence was his statement. In his hands, he held a bundle of letters tied with a simple silk ribbon. He extended his hand and offered them to the magistrate. Thorne writes, "His eyes met mine, and in them I saw no anger, no fear, no plea for mercy. I saw only a profound and weary certainty. It was the look of a man who had come to the end of a long and patient task. In his silence, I understood that he was not asking for justice for himself. He was delivering the evidence for a judgment upon us all." The letters were the hidden source, the physical manifestation of the secrets that had been poisoning the community for months. They were the confessions, the pleas for escape, and the bitter accusations that the women of Columbia County had entrusted to their silent confessor. They were written in the elegant, slanted script of educated ladies, but their contents were a brutal indictment of the men they were married to. They were a secret history of the community, detailing decades of abuse, infidelity, financial ruin, and even, in one case, a covert plot of murder. Thorne's report details his shock as he began to read them. He had known these families his entire life, had believed he understood the nature of their world. But the letters revealed a hidden reality of profound suffering and moral decay. Eleonora Blackwood wrote of her husband's drunken rages and a secret financial debt that threatened to ruin them. Sarah Carver described her husband's cold-hearted sale of a family of slaves, separating a mother from her children for profit. The magistrate's own wife, Elizabeth, had even written a letter, not of complaint, but of a deep philosophical despair over the moral compromises of their lives. This discovery profoundly altered the magistrate's understanding of the mystery. He had seen the conflict as a struggle between Adrian's influence and the planter's authority. Now, he saw that Adrian was not the cause of the crisis, but merely its catalyst. The rot had been there all along, hidden behind a facade of piety and honor. Adrian had not created the poison. He had simply provided a vessel into which it could be poured. His genius was not in manipulation, but in his recognition that the truth, once spoken, would do the work for him. The letters represented a complete reversal of power. The women, legally powerless, had, through their words, created a weapon of immense destructive potential. Adrian, a man with no rights at all, had orchestrated its delivery. He had absorbed their pain and their secrets until he had accumulated enough moral weight to topple the entire structure. He had not stolen these letters. They had been given to him voluntarily, a testament to the trust he had inspired and the desperation of the women who wrote them. He had held them in safekeeping, waiting for the precise moment when their revelation would have the most devastating impact. Thorne realized that Adrian's strategy was one of almost unimaginable patience and foresight. He had survived the whipping, knowing that his endurance would solidify his position and push his enemies to a point of no return. He had waited until the magistrate's own authority had collapsed, until Thorne was morally and legally adrift, before presenting him with the evidence. He was not just handing over letters, he was handing Thorne a choice, a test of his soul. He was asking the magistrate to choose between the law of men and a higher, more terrible form of justice. The discovery of this hidden source marks the final escalation before the climax. The evidence is no longer anecdotal or interpretive. It is tangible, written, and undeniable. It is a chorus of female voices speaking a truth that had been suppressed for generations. Thorne, holding the letters in his hand, understands that he is no longer a magistrate in a legal dispute. He is the custodian of a truth that has the power to either save or destroy his world. The choice is his, but the judgment has been orchestrated by the silent man who had just walked away from his door. The report concludes this section with a note of chilling clarity. "I finally understood the nature of his power," Thorne writes. "He did not need to fight them. He had engineered a situation where they would destroy themselves. He had gathered their sins into a single concentrated dose and delivered it to the heart of their society. He was not a demon. He was a physician, and he had prescribed a fatal cure." In possession of the devastating letters, Magistrate William Thorne was faced with an impossible choice, a dilemma he documents in his report with the cold precision of a man planning a dangerous and uncertain stratagem. He understood that his next action would determine the fate of Columbia County. The letters were a lit fuse, and he was the one holding the match. His decision and his justification for it represent a radical departure from his duties as a magistrate, a tacit admission that the legal system he represented was utterly inadequate for the task at hand. He decided not to act as an officer of the court, but as a reluctant agent of a more elemental justice. Thorne's report outlines the options he considered and dismissed. His first instinct was to destroy the letters, to bury the secrets and attempt to restore the fragile peace. But he recognized this as an act of moral cowardice. To burn these letters, he writes, would be to sanction the rot within, to become complicit in the very hypocrisy that has brought us to this brink. It would be a lie, and the air here is already too thick with lies to breathe. He knew that the truth, once revealed to him, could not be unknown. To ignore it would be to condemn the women to continued suffering and to validate the planters' tyranny. His second option was to release the letters publicly, to expose the crimes and hypocrisies to the entire community. This was the path of righteous, cleansing fire. But he foresaw the consequences with terrifying clarity. To make these confessions public, he reasons, would be to burn the county to the ground. It would incite not justice, but a chaos of accusation, recrimination, and violence. Families would be destroyed, reputations shattered, and the social order would collapse into a war of all against all. The innocent would suffer alongside the guilty. He understood that a truth so potent could not be released without destroying the entire container. He therefore chose a third path, a desperate gamble designed to contain the fallout while still forcing a reckoning. He would stage a private tribunal. His plan was to summon the three most powerful men in the county, Josiah Blackwood, Thomas Carver, and his own influential brother-in-law, a silent partner in many of their enterprises, to his courthouse office. He would confront them with the evidence of their own sins in private, away from the eyes of the community. His justification for this extra-legal action is laid out in his report. "I will have them face the truth in a closed room," he writes. "Let the poison be contained to the guilty." They have acted as a law unto themselves, so let them be judged by a law of their own making, the law of honor and shame. They do not fear God's judgment, and they do not respect the courts, but they fear disgrace. I will force them to look at the unvarnished truth of their lives, as seen through the eyes of the women they claim to own. Perhaps, in that confrontation, some form of justice or at least some form of resolution can be found. His plan was a profound risk. He was intentionally creating a volatile, high-stakes confrontation between men known for their pride and their violent tempers. He was betting that the shock of revelation would lead to some form of personal accountability, a private settlement that might avert a public catastrophe. He was trying to perform a kind of moral surgery to excise the tumor of hypocrisy without killing the patient. It was the decision of a desperate man, a man who had abandoned all faith in the institutions he served and was now relying on a dangerous appeal to the flawed humanity of his enemies. The report then details his preparations, a series of actions that build a palpable sense of suspense. He describes sending formal, non-negotiable summonses to the three men, requesting their presence on a matter of urgent county business. He specifies the time and place, his private office after nightfall, when the courthouse would be empty. He instructs the clerk to leave the building and not return until morning. He is creating a sealed, isolated space for the confrontation to occur. He describes the physical act of preparing the room, placing the bundle of letters in the exact center of his large oak desk. He writes of loading a small, single-shot pistol and placing it in his desk drawer, not as a weapon of aggression, but as a last resort against the chaos he knows he might unleash. "I am no longer a magistrate presiding over a case," he confesses in the report. "I am a man attempting to negotiate a truce in a war that has already been lost. I do not know if this is an act of justice or an act of madness." The final justification for his decision is a recognition of Adrian's role. He understood that Adrian had not just given him the letters, he had given him the responsibility. By placing the evidence in the hands of the law, Adrian had forced the law to either act or to expose its own impotence. Thorne's decisive action was, in a sense, the completion of Adrian's plan. The stage had been set, the actors were being summoned, and the script, written in the secret ink of female despair, was about to be read aloud. The section concludes as he describes waiting in his silent office, the letters on the desk before him, the weight of the community's fate settling upon his shoulders. He hears the sound of approaching footsteps in the empty hall. "They are coming," he writes, his hand shaking, "and I do not know if I'm about to save our world or to sign its death warrant." The decision has been made. The action is in motion, and the narrative has arrived at the threshold of its violent climax. The climax of the Columbia County affair is not described through narrative, but is presented directly through the final primary source found in the magistrate's box, a verbatim transcript of the meeting, recorded by William Thorne. This document, more than any other, captures the raw, explosive power of the truth he unleashed. His stated intention was to create a controlled environment for a reckoning, but the transcript reveals a situation that spiraled into chaos almost immediately, a testament to the fact that some truths, once spoken, cannot be contained. The emotional impact emerges from the stark, unadorned reading of the words that were said and the actions that followed. The transcript begins with Thorne formally greeting the three men, Josiah Blackwood, Thomas Carver, and his brother-in-law, Richard Sterling. The tone is tense, the men impatient and suspicious. Blackwood demands to know the purpose of the clandestine meeting. Thorne, without preamble, picks up the first letter from the bundle. He announces that he is in possession of certain private correspondence that pertains to the moral standing and legal liabilities of those present. He begins to read from the letter of Eleanora Blackwood, her words filling the silent room. "And so I beg you, Adrian, pray for my soul," Thorne reads, his voice steady, "for I cannot endure another night in this house, beside a man who in his drunken neglect caused the death of his own infant son, our little William, and who buried the poor child in an unmarked grave in the north pasture to hide his profound shame from the world." The transcript notes Blackwood's reaction: a sharp intake of breath, a face drained of all color. He leaps to his feet, declaring the letter a forgery, a lie concocted by a hysterical woman and a manipulative slave. Before his denial can gain purchase, Thorne moves to the next letter, this one from Sarah Carver. He reads a passage detailing her husband's secret business dealings with a northern cotton broker, a scheme to defraud his partners, including Blackwood and Sterling, by falsifying crop yield reports. The transcript records Carver's response, a cold, venomous fury. He does not deny the accusation, but instead turns on Blackwood. "You speak of shame," he snarls, his voice dripping with contempt. "This from a man whose plantation is so deeply in debt to creditors in Savannah that he will be bankrupt by Christmas. A fact your loving wife also saw fit to confess." The transcript captures a rapid, brutal escalation. The carefully constructed facade of Southern gentility is stripped away in seconds, revealing the raw, primal instincts beneath. These men, who had presented a united front to the world, were now tearing each other apart, using the secrets their wives had confessed as weapons. The room, intended by Thorne to be a chamber of justice, has become a pit of mutual destruction. The truths contained in the letters are acting as a social acid, dissolving the bonds of kinship and partnership that held their world together. The role of the third man, Richard Sterling, is one of growing terror. As a silent partner in both men's finances, he realizes that their ruin will inevitably be his own. The transcript notes his repeated attempts to intervene, to call for calm, to find a rational solution. But reason has no place in this room. The wounds being exposed are too deep, the betrayals too personal. He is a man watching his entire life's work being consumed in a firestorm of recrimination. The climax arrives with a sudden, shocking finality. Thorne, in a desperate attempt to regain control, picks up another letter, this one detailing Blackwood's physical abuse of his wife. As he begins to read, Blackwood lunges across the desk, not at Thorne, but at Carver, screaming of betrayal and lies. The transcript at this point becomes a series of fragmented, frantic notes from Thorne, the detached observer replaced by a horrified witness. It reads, Mr. Blackwood rose, his face a mask of pure madness. I saw the glint of his pocket pistol, which he had concealed. He aimed not at me, but at Carver, a shot, a scream, not from Carver, but Sterling. The sound of shattered glass as the lamp on the desk overturned. Darkness. The final entry in the transcript is a single chilling sentence written hours later, after the chaos had subsided. One is dead. One is wounded. All are ruined. Adrian has had his justice, and I, in my arrogance, was the instrument of its execution. The interpretation of this final source is clear and devastating. Thorne's attempt to control the truth had failed spectacularly. He had believed he could mediate a contained explosion, but he had instead detonated a bomb. The letters did not lead to repentance. They led to violence and death. The transcript is the ultimate testament to Adrian's strategy. He knew these men better than they knew themselves. He knew their pride, their violence, and their hypocrisy. He understood that they were incapable of confronting their own sins, and that forcing them to do so in the presence of their rivals would inevitably lead to their self-destruction. He did not need to kill them. He only needed to create the conditions in which they would kill each other, metaphorically and literally. The final primary source is not just a record of a meeting. It is the execution of a sentence that had been written decades before. The violent implosion in Magistrate Thorne's office sent shockwaves through Columbia County, but the true consequences are not found in grand historical narratives, but in the quiet, clinical records that document the aftermath. The legacy of Adrian's reckoning is a story of erasure, of families disappearing from the official record, and of a legend being born in the silence left behind. The public was fed a sanitized version of events, but the documentary evidence reveals a far more complete and devastating picture of the social collapse. The first document of the aftermath is a brief, carefully worded article from the Augusta Chronicle, dated October 1838. It reports the tragic murder-suicide of the prominent planter Josiah Blackwood and his wife, Eleonora. The article states that Mr. Blackwood, in a fit of despair brought on by financial troubles, took his own life after a fatal altercation with his wife. It mentions as a footnote a dispute at the courthouse involving Thomas Carver, who was injured and subsequently decided to relocate his family. The official narrative was neat, tidy, and utterly false, a collective effort by the remaining elite to conceal the scandal that had erupted in their midst. The true consequences are traced through more mundane records. Census data from 1840 is starkly revealing. The Blackwood family line in Columbia County ends abruptly in 1838. The household of Thomas Carver is listed as having moved to the new territory of Texas, a common destination for those seeking to escape debt or disgrace. The family of Magistrate William Thorne is recorded as residing in Savannah, his name absent from the legal rolls of his former county. Within 2 years, the three most powerful families, the pillars of the community, had vanished from the landscape they once dominated. Property deeds from the 1840s complete the picture of financial ruin. The Blackwood and Carver plantations, vast tracts of prime cotton land, were sold off piece by piece to creditors from the north. The land that had been the source of their power and pride was now in the hands of strangers, their legacies erased from the very soil they had once owned. The social and economic order had not just been fractured, it had been decapitated. The system had, in essence, consumed its own leaders, just as Adrian had intended. Adrian's own legacy is one of calculated disappearance. He vanishes from all official records after September 1838. There is no bill of sale, no record of his death, no mention of him in any plantation ledger. He simply ceases to exist in the documented world of the masters. His true legacy is found in a different kind of archive, one that was not written down, but passed from one generation to the next in the slave quarters. This legacy is captured in a single, remarkable document, a transcript from the Works Progress Administration's Slave Narrative Project, recorded in 1937. In the transcript, an elderly woman, the daughter of a man who had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation, recounts the story of Adrian the Confessor. She tells the interviewer that Adrian was taken away the night of the courthouse incident by a network of freedmen and sympathetic Quakers. She describes him not as a rebel, but as a kind of folk saint, a man who carried the white folks' sins until they got so heavy they crushed them. Her account preserves the essential truth of the story, that Adrian's power was moral, not physical. This oral history is the only record that gives Adrian a voice after his disappearance. The woman recounts a saying that was attributed to him, a piece of wisdom passed down among the enslaved people of the region. The master's chain is forged of secrets and lies. Break one link, and the whole chain falls apart. This saying encapsulates his philosophy of resistance, a methodology of psychological warfare that was far more sophisticated than any armed rebellion. He had taught them that the most powerful weapon they possessed was the truth. The final documented consequence is found in the life of William Thorne. After relocating to Savannah, he abandoned the law and dedicated the remainder of his life to quiet, anonymous charitable work, primarily focused on literacy programs for free black children. He never spoke of the events of 1838 again, but his actions suggest a man engaged in a long and private penance. He had been the instrument of a terrible justice, and it seems he spent the rest of his life trying to atone for the sins of the world he had once helped to uphold. The legacy of Adrian is therefore twofold. In the official history, he is a ghost, a void. His story was deliberately erased, the records buried, the memory suppressed. But in the unofficial, unwritten history of the oppressed, he became a legend, a symbol of a new and powerful form of resistance. He was proof that one did not need to raise a fist to bring down a master. One only needed to listen, to wait, and to understand that a house built on a foundation of lies will eventually collapse under the weight of its own truth. The story of Adrian and the fall of the Columbia County elite, pieced together from the contents of a buried rosewood box and the fragmented archives of a forgotten past, is more than a tale of revenge. It is a profound meditation on the nature of power, truth, and justice. The historical analysis of these events reveals a strategy of resistance so subtle and so perfectly executed that it was mistaken by its victims for an act of supernatural evil. Adrian's genius was not demonic. It was his deep intuitive understanding of the society that oppressed him, a knowledge he turned back on itself with devastating precision. He understood that the Southern Slavocracy, for all its apparent strength, was built on a foundation of profound psychological fragility. The planters' entire identity was predicated on a series of carefully constructed illusions. The illusion of their own moral righteousness, the illusion of their benevolent paternalism, and the illusion of the happy, contented slave. Their power depended on these illusions remaining intact, not just in the eyes of the world, but in their own eyes as well. Adrian's method was to systematically dismantle these illusions, not with force, but with the quiet, corrosive power of the truth. He weaponized the confessional, a sacred space in the Christian tradition, turning it into a theater of psychological warfare. He recognized that the plantation mistresses, trapped in a gilded cage of social expectation, were the weak point in the system's emotional armor. They were both beneficiaries and victims of the patriarchy, and their silent complicity was a source of immense, unspoken guilt. By offering them a space to confess, Adrian was not just gathering intelligence, he was facilitating a moral awakening that would inevitably set them against their husbands and the system they represented. His victory was not in the deaths at the courthouse, but in the social and moral collapse that preceded it. The violence was merely a symptom of the disease he had exposed. He proved that a system built on the denial of one group's humanity requires its enforcers to deny their own as well. By forcing the planters to confront the truths spoken by their wives, he forced them to confront the men they had become, brutal, hypocritical, and morally bankrupt. Their self-destruction was not an act of passion, but the logical outcome of a lifetime of self-deception. But the story does not end with the erasure of the Blackwood, Carver, and Thorne families from the landscape of Georgia. The most unsettling question is what became of Adrian's methodology. Was his quiet war an isolated act of personal genius, or was it a transmissible idea, a new gospel of resistance that could spread from one plantation to the next? The final document to consider suggests a haunting possibility. It is a letter found in the archives of a Methodist circuit rider who traveled through the Deep South in the 1840s. Writing to his bishop from a rural parish in Alabama in 1845, he describes a strange and familiar phenomenon. A peculiar spiritual malaise has taken hold here, he writes. It seems to emanate from the slave quarters, centered around a quiet, well-spoken man, to whom the women of our most prominent families have inexplicably begun to confess their husbands' sins. The men are enraged, but they can prove no wrongdoing. A strange paranoia has taken root in this community. I have seen this before, and I fear it will not end well. The letter does not name the man. It provides no further details. It is a single, chilling echo across the years. Was this Adrian, having established a new life and a new identity, continuing his silent work? Or had the legend of Adrian the Confessor inspired others? Had his method, the art of dismantling masters with their own hidden truths, become a legacy, a form of resistance passed in whispers from one enslaved community to another, a quiet, spreading contagion of truth in an empire of lies? This open question is the final, haunting legacy of the man they called Adrian. It suggests that his story was not an end, but a beginning. It reframes the history of slave resistance, suggesting that alongside the dramatic revolts and escapes, there was another, quieter war being waged. A war for the soul, fought not in the fields with machetes, but in the gardens and parlors, with silence, patience, and the devastating weight of a secret patiently kept. The box in the courthouse wall may have buried one story, but the idea it contained could never be truly entombed. The ultimate horror of the Columbia County affair, for the men who experienced it, was not the loss of their lives or their fortunes, but the loss of their certainty. Adrian proved that their power was an illusion, that their victims were not powerless, and that the most dangerous secrets are the ones we keep from ourselves. He demonstrated that justice, when denied all legal and social avenues, will find another way to be heard, not as a shout, but as a whisper that can bring down an entire world. The truth, as he knew, does not bleed, it only waits. The stories that shape us the most are rarely the ones found in official textbooks. They are the whispers, the legends, the records buried in courthouse walls. These are the truths that reveal who we truly are. If you believe that understanding our present requires us to fearlessly confront the darkest corners of our past, then you have found your community. Subscribe to Before the Story. We don't just tell stories, we excavate them. Hit the notification bell, because the most important truths are often the ones you least expect. Thank you for bearing witness with us tonight.